Quote, liberty, not being a fruit of all climates, is not within the reach of all peoples, end quote. Now this sounds to me like the kind of thing someone would say to justify dominating some other group of people. I don't know about you, but apologies for tyranny are one of the last things I want to see in a book about political theory. But that's where we are. Hello, everybody, and welcome to part 12 of my examination and critique of Rousseau's Social Contract. Today we're going to be covering Book 3, Chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7 is called Mixed Governments, and it's one of those little, here's some definition chapters. And Chapter 8 is one of those ones where kind of the mask starts to come off. Rousseau is here in Chapter 8. The title of the chapter is That All Forms of Government Do Not Suit All Countries, which sounds like a benign thing to say, but what Rousseau turns it into is actually something much darker. So without further ado, let's get into it. So, starting with Chapter 7, Mixed Governments. Book 3, Chapter 7, sorry. Rousseau begins by talking about how all governments are mixed to some degree. Quote, an isolated ruler must have subordinate magistrates, a popular government must have a head, end quote. This is kind of that usual reasonable sounding stuff that we get at the start of Rousseau's chapters, right? He says something that's fairly uncontroversial, only to steer it into a horrible direction as the chapter goes on. He continues, executive power is distributed between the greater and lesser numbered groups. The larger group may depend on the smaller for direction or vice versa. When that distribution is equal, that is good because it creates, quote, unity in the government, end quote. Rousseau notes that in this sense, England is good and Poland is bad. What Rousseau's talking about here is like, if you have a king, then the king is the lesser numbered group and his subordinates are the greater numbered group. If you have a democracy, then the citizenry that can vote is the greater numbered group, and those who actually are kind of in positions of representative power are the lesser number. And first off, he's begging the question, and I mean that in the actual sense that he's assuming, for the sake of his own argument, that unity in the government is a good thing. What if the government, for instance, is aiming for policies that impoverish the people, as Rousseau's framework has claimed it is supposed to? That would be a problem. We wouldn't want unity in the government. We want the government to fight against itself as much as possible. But in a broader sense, this part of the chapter is basically saying that when there's multiple different groups in the government, having them have similar distributions makes them more unifiable, right? In that, since they have comparable powers, none of these groups dominates all the rest, and therefore the government moves more smoothly. That may or may not be what we want, depending on the quality of the government. Rousseau continues. He talks about how simplicity is a virtue in government, but sometimes division is necessary. Quote, when the prince is more closely related to the sovereign than the people to the prince, this lack of proportion must be cured by the division of the government. Similarly, we'll get to that in a second. This appears to me to be more pseudo-mathematical gibberish, which we've seen Rousseau using a lot of in the last few chapters. Since nobody knows how closely someone is related to the sovereign, it's kind of a moot point. There's no measurable thing here for you to argue. You just, it's just a thing to argue and say, well, clearly, blah, 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 but you can't really provide any evidence. This will always be a source of unsolvable argument, and therefore it doesn't really give us anything. There's always going to be groups in the government that are fighting to claim that the prince is too closely related to the sovereign, or compared to the people to the prince, and that therefore we need a division of the government. There are always going to be people who are claiming, well, these things are in reverse order, so we need to We need to re-centralize the government, and they're always going to be doing this for their own personal gain, right? There's nothing in Rousseau's framework that prevents this from being the case. And so really, honestly, we can kind of ignore this. There's nothing here. He's saying things without saying anything, which is kind of something something we've gotten used to expecting from Rousseau. Then he continues by talking about something that he calls intermediate magistrates, and says that if they exist, they do not mix the government, but rather they moderate it. And he also says that tribunals can be used to concentrate a government that's too large or too lax. Now, again, now we have a government with 3 levels. We have a king, and then we have intermediate magistrates, and then we have like lower level magistrate. He's being very vague here, and it's not really making a whole lot of sense. Obviously, intermediate magistrates are going to be more likely to side with one or the other side between the smaller and larger groups, whatever that means, and there's not really much here for us to learn. There's always going to be people who are claiming that, we need intermediate magistrates to do X or Y or Z, and the question is which of these purposes are intermediate magistrates going to be hired and then parasitize more on the people. Rousseau is creating a 3rd level of government also to moderate the government, without really explaining what this new moderation term means. It's kind of the same rhetorical trick that progressives use, right? We're doing things that are progressive, and we define them as progressive, and therefore, since progressive is a good thing, since progress is a good thing, we want to have more progressiveness, right? In this sense, Rousseau is using the term moderate in the same way. Like these additional magistrates that are going to chew up more of the wealth of the people, well, they're moderating the government. And therefore, always moderating the government is a good thing. This is a Platonic mean kind of thing. And for someone who nitpicks at Plato a lot, Rousseau certainly is using a lot of his ideas kind of in the background without really realizing it, it seems like. And in the final part of this chapter, Rousseau says, quote, "The maxima of both strength and weakness are found in simple governments, while the mixed forms result in a mean strength," end quote. This is, of course, more failed pseudo-math jargon, right? The maxima of both strength and weakness in simple governments means what exactly, right? That governments have the most strengths and weaknesses when they're simple, ? And then the mixed forms result in a mean strength, but then it's not really like the word mean here, mean means average, right? And if you take one thing and you take a bunch of things and you divide them by the number of things, that's that's what the mean is. But this is more like a sliding scale where we go from, a simple government A versus simple government B, and then we kind of move the slider back and forth to determine how much mixing there is. And that's not going to produce a mean. It might produce like a mean. You might linearize that to talk about it in like a mathematical sense, or you might say, it's a parabola, and so we're going to have this, but it's not the same thing as the mean. And so Rousseau is just using some really weird language here, and it doesn't really tell us anything either, because it's not true, because he's kind of hedging, right? He's saying the maxima of both strength and weakness are found in simple governments, which doesn't make really that much sense. That it has the most strength and the most weakness at the same time. You could rhetorically fiddle with things to make that kind of sort of make sense, right? Like that the strength of a monarchy is that you have one person who makes all the decisions, but that the weakness of a monarchy is that that one person also is more likely to worry about his own self rather than the people. You can I could see kind of fiddling with it, finagling it that way, but Rousseau doesn't give us enough here to actually work with. That's kind of the problem. He's being very vague, and he's just kind of hand-waving and hoping that we all shut up and believe him. Anyway, that concludes Chapter 7. So next up is Chapter 8, that all forms of government do not suit all countries. And this one is the real, let's just say it has a lot of really negative consequences, and we'll put it at that. Okay, Rousseau starts Chapter 8 by saying, quote, "Liberty, not being a fruit of all climates, is not within the reach of all peoples," end quote. Now, this sounds to me like the kind of thing someone would say to justify dominating some other group of people, right? The Greeks had the idea that certain people were suited for slavery, the ancient Greeks, right? This is not really, this doesn't really help, right? All this basically does is give people who want to enslave others a reason that they can justify it. To connect this directly to climate is even worse because what it sounds to me is that first off, it disconnects it from the people themselves. It is certainly true, and people have argued, okay, there's certainly an element of truth to it, right? That liberty is best suited to a virtuous people, right? That's something that you've heard people argue a lot, but at the same time, there is no people that is perfectly virtuous. And therefore, you can at least argue that some liberty should be afforded even to unvirtuous peoples. But then what Rousseau does is he disconnects this, deservedness of liberty even from the people themselves. He connects it to the climate. It sounds to me like what he's trying to do is kind of work up an apology or a justification for the problems that came along with African colonization. He continues, since the government gets what it consumes from the surplus of the people, if that surplus is too small or if the appetite of the government is too large, the government cannot stand. Okay, fair, I guess, if we're going to assume that the government is this thing that gets what it consumes by taxation, right? What a government, rather than a state, right, what a voluntary government would do is it would get what it consumes by providing voluntarily agreed to services to people. That is to say, because the service is voluntarily agreed to, right, both parties gain. One party gets stuff to provide, provides security, and then they get paid for providing security. If there really is no surplus at all, that's a very dire circumstance. That's a circumstance that's so dire that you really can't even have children. Any society that really has no surplus at all is pretty much doomed at that point. They've already fallen too far. You need to have a little bit of surplus in order to feed children before they can work, right? Things like that. And so, this no surplus idea is so far away from, real existing societies that it's really not worth considering. But if we try to consider it, what we end up with is we end up where we have these people who are literally farming all day from dawn till dusk. They farm and then they sleep with no rest or anything like that, with no leisure, right? Barely avoiding starvation with all that work time. This is not a common state for humanity, even in the 1700s. Leisure, for instance, is a form of surplus, right? If you have a group of people that, they work and they produce pretty much only what they need to survive, but they also only work 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day, then they have a pretty decent amount of time that is effectively leisure. Now, if they wanted to, or if they needed to build more stuff, like for instance, to afford children, then they would have to reduce their leisure time in order to produce more so that they can feed their kids while the kids grow up. Fair enough. But this is not a situation, this is not the same thing as having no surplus. If the people have leisure, then there is a surplus, even though it doesn't look like one, because leisure is a form of surplus. Rousseau continues, he quote, "The charge should be measured not by the amount of the impositions, but by the path they have to travel in order to get back to those from whom they came. When the circulation is prompt and well established, it does not matter whether much or little is paid. The people is always rich, and, financially speaking, all is well." End quote. Now, this assumes charitably that the wealth extorted from the people by the state somehow makes it back to them. The possibility of a plutocracy or even just an oversized bureaucracy that kind of chews up these excesses is not addressed by Rousseau here. And it really needs to be, right? Rousseau has said already that part of what the government does is it makes the people dependent on the government. And so, right, that's kind of encouraging the prince or the prince's, and I'm saying the prince in Rousseau's terms, so it could, whatever executive body or legislative body exists to make and execute the laws, that's the prince to Rousseau, right? it implies, Rousseau's framework has implied already that the prince is supposed to take as much from the people as it possibly can to make sure that the people can't revolt against the prince. But and so for him to just basically kind of hand wave past the government, consuming the people's excesses so that they are more pliable is something that he shouldn't be doing because he's already advocated for it. Rousseau continues by noting that more distant governments, that is to say, the government being distant from the people, are more burdensome and so need a richer populace. He gives examples, and basically it's like a monarchy is most distant, and therefore its spending is more burdensome, and therefore a monarchy is only appropriate for a rich nation. But why are we supposed to believe that more burdensomeness is a good thing under any circumstances, right? If we can choose a state that has no burdensomeness to it, right, then we would obviously we would obviously prefer to move in that direction. But Rousseau doesn't even think about that because he's kind of pushing everything onto like one axis, and that axis is like the number of people in the state. Remember, he did this with like democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. He's like, well, democracy is for small groups, and aristocracy is for medium-sized groups, and monarchy is for big groups. And it's like, well, if you only have this one axis, then yeah, you got to put everything on the axis, but it might not be the right axis, and that's kind of what we're thinking about here. There's no reason to believe that so a monarchy is for rich nations and it's for populous nations, but then that also implies that populous nations deserve more burdensome governments, which is just nonsensical, or at least it's kind of the thing where Rousseau is putting like an air of inevitability to it that doesn't need to be there, right? That the whole point of the classical liberal project is to make government into an agent, a voluntary thing, and while Locke pushed in that direction, he still wasn't all the way there. But Rousseau is taking all of this classical liberal terminology and turning it into an even more totalitarian state, which is exactly the wrong direction to push these things. It's might makes right, just with more steps. Rousseau continues. He says that climate affects the productivity of land, and therefore the government will be affected by that productivity. Barren lands should stay uncultivated or be populated by savages. Poor lands are for barbarians, people who have, not very good governments. And then the best lands go to the people who are free peoples. This is again a return to this subsistence farming model. Rousseau does not recognize that extended capital structures can result in higher productivity, or that different countries could reach mutually beneficial agreements to deal with relative scarcity and comparative advantage. Now, remember, he was writing before David Ricardo, but still, right? It's not simply the productivity of the land that matters. The productivity of the people can be in effect as well. And, if the people can't produce enough food, but can produce enough steel, then at least in theory, they could trade with another country, and both of these countries could be made more wealthy by these acts. Rousseau is assuming that every country kind of has to be autarkic, that it has to produce everything that it uses, and that's not a good assumption to make, right? First off, it requires a police structure that prevents people from trading freely, right? And it also keeps people kind of desolate or deprived, basically. Rousseau then claims that hot lands are more productive, yet the peoples of hot lands are content with less food, less luxury, etc. He says that the hot countries are in need of people. And again, he's sounding like he's promoting African colonization models. Cultural aspects involving more or less demand for luxury and fine foods may indeed be influenced by long-term historical knowledge of productivity levels. If your people has always been fairly unproductive, then you might have built up a culture that kind of eschews luxury, that says, oh, I don't need that, that's more than I need. I don't need to have, a steak every day, I can have rice or millet, 3 days out of the week or something like that. Those things can exist as a form of cultural historical memory, right? In the sense that hey, we often have famines, so we have to be more careful about saving food. Fair enough. But that doesn't mean that these people are innately less attuned to enjoying luxury. If indeed these people had systems that allowed them to accumulate capital and gain wealth over time, then surely they would find uses for this extra capital. Rousseau is kind of trying to justify giving certain people less because culturally they're used to wanting less. And this also seems to be like a pro-colonization thing. Like, oh, these people, we're not giving them as much as we have when we colonize their country, but that's okay because they're used to it. And it's like, well, that's not voluntary. That's very much non-voluntary. That's the use of military power to or cultural differences to basically you get stuff from people that if they were better informed they wouldn't give up. That's also not something other than might makes right with extra steps. To finish off this chapter, Rousseau goes on this digression about the difficulty of setting up a revolt in heavily populated countries. He says basically that it's easier for government to track down dissidents and silence them. Quote, "The advantage of tyrannical government therefore lies in acting at great distances. Ellipsis. The least populous countries are thus the fittest for tyranny." End quote. Now, he just said that these hot countries, the ones that are being colonized, are in need of people. That is to say, they are least populous. And therefore, he's saying, well, these least populous countries are fittest for tyranny. And guess who's going to be doing the tyrannizing? Well, that sounds like it's going to be, France, England, whatever. But even more than that, this whole last section of the chapter is so confused because it puts all the qualities of a government on a scale based on population size, which we kind of talked about a minute ago. Are we to believe, for instance, that a medium-sized country with an aristocracy is more fit for a tyranny than an absolute monarchy in a large country? Well, no, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you just put everything on this line of number of people, then that's what you would expect based on what Rousseau is kind of pseudo-mathing at us. None of this is really coherent at this point. Rousseau has simply chosen a single variable and kind of plopped all the things he cares about onto that axis, with really no real attention to confounding factors. When he mentions confounding factors, it's usually done in such a way as to effectively say nothing, right? We've already had him talk about how, heat and cold, relatively affect the level of cultivation that should be done and the quality of government people should have. But it doesn't come down to anything because, there's more than one way to become wealthy, right? You can become wealthy by being a really good farmer, or you can become wealthy by being a really good chartered accountant. And so whenever he looks at a different axis from the number of people, he comes up with stuff that doesn't bolster his point, and so he ends up kind of having to double speak it in a way that doesn't say anything at all. This appears to me to just be an apology for being a bad colonizer and some nonsense about population and productivity and stuff like that. I mean, it's not even necessarily true that barren lands should stay uncultivated or stay populated by savages, right? Again, barren lands could be populated by people who do something else to then make a product that they sell to others for the stuff that they need. Rousseau's making this very autarkic, mercantilist assumption that just doesn't necessarily hold up in the real world. I mean, it can be the case, right? And of course, if you have a choice between cultivating barren land or productive land, you probably aim for the productive land more often than not. But the whole point of the division of labor is to give people the opportunities to do things using the materials that you have. Part of the goal is to try to make it so that even submarginal lands find a use in some sense, right? That all the materials that you have get used as efficiently as they can be used, so that you don't leave anything fallow that doesn't need to be left fallow for maintenance purposes. Anyway, that's how he ends this chapter 8 of book 3, and it just doesn't play well with me. It sounds a lot like he's trying to justify treating foreign peoples poorly, trying to justify being a bad colonizer, being an especially bad colonizer, and then trying to justify that certain people don't deserve liberty, so we don't have to give it to them, or even try, or even like consider it. They're just used to they're used to being poor, so we'll just let them continue to be poor. And as long as what we take from them doesn't make them extra poor, well, we can kind of skim off the top, and we get more out of that than they do. It's I don't know. It's another really weird chapter where he seems to be saying a lot of bad things about government, but supporting them. So anyway, that will do it for this week, at least as far as Rousseau goes. I'm still working on some additional projects. Maybe I'll get some stuff up a little later in the week. But anyway, this has been part 12 of my look at Rousseau. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Next time, Rousseau finally starts to get into what makes a good government, it looks like, based on the title of the next chapter. So maybe we'll learn something next time. Who knows? But yeah, chapters 7 and 8, book 3, not particularly interesting. Some mathematical gibberish and some justifications for keeping people under your heel, if that is something that you're able to do. And a lot of pseudo-math jargon that doesn't make any real sense. Anyway. Have a good day, and I will see you next time.